Lieutenant Colonel William Adams, a 74-year-old veteran, a man who had once led soldiers through the most dangerous combat zones, a man decorated for heroism and sacrifice, now quietly arriving for a routine medical appointment at the local Veterans Medical Center. It was a cold, unforgiving rain that day, the kind that seeped into your bones, and inside the waiting room buzzed with staff too busy, visitors too distracted. When the system flagged a scheduling error, no one asked questions. No one offered a seat. No one cared who he was. They simply told him to wait outside. They didn't recognize the name they were pushing aside. They didn't know that the man sitting alone under the storm was the very commander who had once pulled lives out of the fire. And they certainly didn't know that the man coming fast through the storm, Colonel Robert Davis, was arriving not out of anger, but out of loyalty to stand beside the man who had once saved him. It began as a quiet, everyday dismissal, but it became a moment that stripped the room bare, a moment that revealed one lasting truth: the way you treat the person you think is no one, that is the true measure of who you are. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and stay with us as we unfold a story that proves the most powerful lessons often come from those who never ask to be seen. Rain hammered the windshield as Colonel Robert Davis gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes locked on the road ahead. The wipers slapped back and forth in a frantic rhythm, barely keeping up with the downpour. His black SUV roared down the slick Ohio highway tires, hissing against the wet asphalt. On the passenger seat, his phone blared a speaker call, the voice on the other end crackling, "Colonel, he's still there. Sitting outside. Hasn't moved." Davis's jaw clenched. "You make sure he stays there. Do not let him leave. I am 5 minutes out." His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the urgency cutting through each word. He didn't bother to explain why he was calling from retirement, why a man like him was racing across town on a stormy Thursday afternoon. There was no time. He hung up, tapped the steering wheel twice in quick succession, a habit he'd never shaken from deployment days. A glance at the dashboard clock, 2:47 p.m. He accelerated. The sky outside was a grim wall of gray, the kind of storm that turned streets into rivers and erased the outlines of buildings. To any bystander, it was just another car, just another driver rushing through bad weather. But inside that SUV, Davis was fighting a memory he'd thought he could leave buried the face of a man who'd once stood between his squad and certain death, the man now sitting alone in the rain because some receptionist didn't know what name they were dealing with. At the Veterans Medical Center, a crowd huddled inside, safe from the storm. No one noticed the black SUV slicing through the parking lot, ignoring every line and marker, aiming straight for the main entrance. Inside the vehicle, Davis flipped his phone back on, scrolled through recent texts. Emily's message flashed up again. "Dad, an old vet named Bill Adams, is waiting outside. Scheduling mistake. Do you know him?" Davis gritted his teeth. Know him. Bill Adams had once been his commanding officer, the man who dragged Davis out of an ambush site, bleeding and broken, refusing evacuation until every soldier under his command was accounted for. That was a lifetime ago. And yet here they were. The rain thickened, heavy drops pounding the hood like drumbeats. Davis's phone buzzed again. Another text from Emily. "He's still there, Dad. Won't come inside. Should we bring him something?" Davis typed quickly, one hand on the wheel. "No, do not touch him. I'm almost there." The SUV fishtailed slightly as it hit a flooded corner, but Davis corrected with practiced ease, eyes locked forward. It wasn't anger driving him, not exactly. It was something colder, more precise, the unshakable knowledge that leadership didn't end with retirement, that some debts were never marked paid. Bill Adams wasn't just any old man sitting on a bench. He was a man whose silence spoke louder than medals, whose patience under the pounding rain said more about character than any plaque on a wall. And now, thanks to an administrative screw-up, the staff at that clinic was about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. He pulled into the lot, slammed the gear into park, without shutting off the engine. For a heartbeat, he sat there listening to the rain batter the windows, steeling himself. Leadership was a strange thing. Some men wore it like a uniform, bright and public, demanding recognition. Others carried it like a scar, invisible, but shaping everything they did. Adams was the latter. Always had been. Davis shoved open the door, stepping out into the downpour. Water flattened his neatly pressed shirt against his back, seeped into his shoes. He didn't care. One look toward the bench under the narrow awning by the entrance confirmed everything. A thin, elderly figure seated perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap clothes, soaked through eyes fixed calmly ahead. He wasn't shaking, wasn't complaining, wasn't even moving. Inside, behind the glass doors, Davis caught a glimpse of staff members going about their routines, heads down, oblivious. He felt something dark coil in his chest. That ends now. What kind of storm makes a retired colonel break every rule, speed through traffic, and walk into a clinic dripping wet, not a storm of rain? A storm of debt, of loyalty, of unfinished duty. And as Davis strode forward, the camera angle in your mind's eye shifts, pulling away from his determined figure and sweeping toward the old man on the bench, the silent commander who waited in the rain. But before Colonel Davis could reach him, the story of how this man came to sit alone in the rain was already unfolding inside the walls of the clinic. The automatic doors of the Veterans Medical Center hissed open at exactly 2 o'clock, and Lieutenant Colonel William Bill Adams stepped inside, brushing raindrops from his jacket sleeves. His thin figure moved with slow precision, not from weakness, but from the careful control of someone long practiced at conserving energy. The young receptionist, Sarah Mills, barely glanced up as he approached the counter holding out his neatly folded appointment card. William Adams, 74 years old, with Dr. Levine Bill, said quietly. Sarah typed rapidly, her brow furrowing as the system lagged. She bit her lip, squinting at the screen. I'm not seeing you on today's schedule, sir. Let me check something. She clicked through several menus, sighing under her breath as the phones rang around her. Behind Bill, the waiting area buzzed, patients shifting in chairs, nurses calling names, a child whining softly. Bill waited patiently, hands folded, eyes steady. Sarah clicked one more time, shaking her head slightly. Sir, it looks like you were rescheduled last week. A system update, some appointments were shifted automatically. Did you not get the notice? Bill's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the counter, but his voice stayed level. I didn't receive anything. He slid the card closer. I've had this appointment for 3 months. Sarah sighed, glancing over her shoulder. We're at full capacity today. We don't have extra slots. She tapped her keyboard, nervously, cheeks reddening. I'm really sorry, sir. There's just no room. At that moment, Jim Carter, the floor supervisor, appeared at her side, leaning over to glance at the screen. What's the problem, Sarah? Reschedule error, she murmured. Mr. Adams here wasn't notified. Jim gave Bill a quick once-over eyes, flicking over the soaked jacket, the thinning white hair, the quiet posture. Well, if he wants, he can wait outside. We don't have chairs to spare today. Sarah hesitated. Sir, you can wait out front. If there's a no-show, maybe we can squeeze you in. Bill nodded once, slow and controlled. Thank you. Without a word of protest, without so much as a sigh, he turned and walked back out into the rain. Emily Davis, standing near the printer station, watched the entire exchange. Her hands froze over the stack of papers she was sorting, heart-sinking as she saw the old man pushed aside so easily. Something tugged at the back of her mind, a whisper of recognition she couldn't place. Adams. Why did that name sound familiar? She peeked through the glass as Bill took his seat on the narrow metal bench beneath the awning. Rain lashed sideways across the concrete, soaking his shoes, his cuffs darkening the knees of his pants. He sat motionless, hands folded in his lap, gaze straight ahead, as though the weather and the humiliation alike were passing storms he could outlast. Inside, Jim shrugged and went back to his rounds, tossing a smirk over his shoulder. You can't save everyone, Emily, he said lightly. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. Something was wrong. She could feel it like a pressure in her chest. Pulling out her phone, she typed a quick message to her father, Colonel Robert Davis. Dad, there's an old veteran here, William Adams. Scheduling mix-up. He's sitting outside in the rain. Do you know him? The minutes dragged. Emily tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept flicking back to the window, to the unmoving silhouette on the bench. When her phone buzzed, she nearly dropped it. The reply was sharp, cold, unmistakable. Keep him there. I'm on my way. Her breath caught. Outside, the rain poured harder, drumming against the pavement in relentless waves. Bill Adams remained exactly where he was, shoulders squared, jaw set, as if every muscle in his body knew how to wait. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle over her, her heart thudding in her chest. This wasn't just a patient caught in a scheduling error. This was someone important, someone who mattered more than anyone here realized. Without needing to check her phone again, she knew Colonel Davis was coming fast. And soon everything in this building was going to change. Emily sat at her cluttered desk, the fluorescent lights above flickering faintly, casting thin shadows across the mountain of files stacked at her elbow. She kept glancing toward the front lobby, unable to shake the image of the man outside, drenched and unmoving, his military straight posture, defying the downpour battering the glass doors. Lieutenant Colonel William Adams left to sit like an afterthought. A voice broke into her thoughts. "Who's that old guy out there?" It was Chris, one of the younger admin staff, leaning casually against the edge of her desk, sipping from a paper coffee cup. His tone was light, curious, unaware of the tension knotting in Emily's chest. She turned her voice quieter than usual. "His name is Bill Adams." She hesitated, feeling the weight of the memory push forward from the back of her mind. "My father's mentioned him before." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Your dad, the colonel." Really, Emily nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "He's not just any veteran. My dad used to tell stories about him. In Afghanistan, there was this mission. My dad's unit was ambushed, cut off. They were pinned down, no way out. Bill Adams led the team that pulled them out. My dad says if it weren't for him, none of them would have made it home." Chris's casual posture straightened slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. Before either of them could continue, Jim Carter's voice cut sharply across the room. "Emily, you're not seriously worked up about this, are you?" Emily froze, turning slowly. Jim stood near the doorway, arms folded, the permanent edge of a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Look, I get it," he said, voice dripping with dismissive ease. "Old soldiers' war stories, medals, sure. But here today, he's just another guy with a canceled appointment. We can't stop the whole building because one old-timer wants special treatment." The casual cruelty in his tone made Emily's stomach tighten. She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to snap back. She had worked under Jim long enough to know how little he respected anything outside the spreadsheet numbers and shift schedules. To him, a name like Adams was just another file, another body in a chair, another minor inconvenience. Chris shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Emily felt the air in the room change, the pressure tightening like a storm coil. She turned away, not trusting herself to speak, instead reaching for her phone. She gripped it tightly, feeling the vibration under her fingers. She didn't need to open it. She knew. Her father was on his way. Colonel Robert Davis wasn't the kind of man to send panicked texts or make empty threats. If he was coming here, it meant this mattered, and it meant that no one, least of all Jim, understood just how big this was. For a moment, Emily let herself look out the window again. Bill Adams was still there, unmoving, his silhouette blurred by the cascade of rainwater racing down the glass. He didn't know what was coming. Neither did anyone else inside. The tension hung thick in the office air, the uneasy shuffle of papers, the hum of overhead lights, the muted ring of distant phones. And then, without warning, the front doors burst open. A gust of wind and rain swept into the lobby, carrying the sharp slam of a car door outside. Every head in the waiting room turned, conversations faltering mid-sentence. Emily's breath caught as she rose slowly from her chair. It was happening. And suddenly the old man on the bench was no longer just an overlooked patient or a scheduling mishap. Everyone in that building was about to learn who Bill Adams really was. Colonel Robert Davis stepped out of his black SUV, rain cascading over his shoulders, soaking through his shirt, as he shut the door with a sharp click. For a split second he stood still, in the storm eyes locked on the figure sitting silently under the narrow awning. Bill Adams sat exactly as he had been for the past 45 minutes, hands folded neatly in his lap, posture straight, despite the cold, the wet, and the casual dismissal he'd been handed. Davis drew in a steady breath, gave a small, tight nod in Bill's direction. A soldier's acknowledgement, silent but unmistakable, and then turned sharply on his heel, heading for the doors. The automatic entrance slid open with a hiss, and Davis stepped into the fluorescent-lit lobby without hesitation. The sudden blast of clean, clinical air hit him as sharply as the mix of antiseptic and cheap coffee. Inside the waiting room buzzed with low murmurs, shifting paper, the occasional cough. No one noticed him at first. Then Emily saw him. She froze, heart-pounding eyes widening as her father strode in his face carved from stone, his presence slicing through the room like a blade. Colonel Davis didn't slow, didn't glance at the front desk where Sarah Mills sat, blinking in confusion. Jim Carter, halfway through joking with a nurse by the counter, turned at the movement. His brow furrowed, irritation flickering over his features as he stepped forward. "Sir, you need to check in at the front desk." Davis stopped, his eyes locking onto Jim's with a weight that hit harder than any raised voice. The colonel's uniform, though technically retired, still carried the sharp creases and perfect fit of a man who never let his standards slip. Rain dripped steadily from his sleeves, pooling at his boots, but he paid no attention. "Where's my commander?" The words sliced through the room, flattening the hum of conversation, drawing every set of eyes toward him. Jim straightened, defensive reflex kicking in. "Look, sir, I don't know what you think is happening here, but we're at capacity today. There's no commander scheduled, and if you could just—" Davis took a single step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Do you know who I am?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that filled a room. Jim opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly thrown off balance. "The man you left outside Davis," continued each word crisp, deliberate, "is Lieutenant Colonel William Adams. 30 years in the service. Bronze Star Distinguished Service. Across multiple deployments, he commanded the extraction team that saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers under enemy fire. And you left him outside in the rain." The color drained from Jim's face. Around them, nurses and patients sat, frozen tension crackling in the air like static before a lightning strike. Sarah, at the front desk, let out a soft, horrified breath, her fingers shaking slightly over her keyboard. Jim tried to recover, lifting a hand in a half shrug. "I wasn't told. There was no way we could have known." Davis's eyes hardened. "You shouldn't have needed to know." His voice dropped, deadly quiet, the kind of tone that made even trained soldiers straighten in their seats. "He's a veteran sitting outside your Veterans Medical Center. That should have been enough." Emily, heart hammering, moved quickly behind the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she woke the computer screen and pulled up the internal system. She knew what she had to do. If no one else was going to show Jim Carter what was at stake here, she would. As she typed, her father stood motionless at the center of the room, every eye fixed on him, the atmosphere thick with the realization that something far bigger than a scheduling mishap was unfolding right before them. No one noticed the rainwater still streaming down Davis's arms, or the wet footprints he left across the linoleum floor. They were too busy watching the storm he had just brought inside. The military records flashed onto the screen, bold white letters stacking line by line. The waiting room, which had moments before been filled with quiet murmurs, rustling papers, and the occasional cough, fell into a sudden, uneasy silence. Eyes turned toward the monitor as if drawn by some invisible pull, every conversation suspended mid-word. Emily stood to the side, her chest tight, watching the words appear, as if they were being carved into stone. "Lieutenant Colonel William Adams," she read, her voice clear, measured, slicing through the thick air. "United States Army. 30 years of service. Bronze Star. Distinguished Service Cross. Purple Heart." A faint shifting sound stirred near the back. One of the younger veterans, who had been slouched in his seat moments before, sat up straighter, his fingers tightening on the brim of his ball cap. Another man, older with a limp, quietly pushed himself upright, his expression tightening as the weight of the name settled over him. Near the window, a Marine veteran leaning on a crutch adjusted his posture, eyes narrowing as the text continued to scroll. Emily kept reading, her voice threading through the still air. "Operation Bagram. Led rapid extraction team under enemy fire. Credited with saving 11 soldiers trapped in an ambush. Refused medevac until all men were safely evacuated." The words landed like weight on every pair of shoulders in the room. A quiet rustle spread across the space as more veterans stood, not in response to any order, but as an instinctual automatic gesture. Jackets were straightened, caps were slipped off, backs were pulled a little taller. Not because anyone had said they should, but because they understood. And as the final line appeared on the screen, Emily felt her throat tighten. Commanding Officer Operation Silverhawk, Afghanistan. Successful rescue of pinned reconnaissance team, including then-Captain Robert Davis, later promoted to colonel. The silence that followed was absolute. Hooked into every mind in that room was the same sudden, sharp question. How had they let this happen? How had they let a man who once commanded life and death for an entire squad, a man whose leadership under fire had shaped the careers and survival of soldiers still living today, be left to sit outside in the rain like some lost, irrelevant stranger, dismissed over a simple scheduling mistake? The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Sarah, frozen at the front desk, pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide, staring at the screen. The receptionist beside her looked pale, her fingers trembling slightly where they hovered over the mouse. Even Jim Carter, whose crossed arms had once radiated smug confidence, now looked uneasy, his face twitching as he fought to process what was unraveling right in front of him. But none of them spoke. None of them moved. Instead, they watched the slow, subtle wave ripple through the waiting area as more veterans rose to their feet, as though guided by something older and deeper than the rules of the clinic. Some stood at full attention, others simply inclined their heads slightly, their eyes lowered in quiet respect. A few younger faces among them glanced toward the doors with tightening jaws, realizing with sickening clarity that the man they had watched walk out earlier, the old soldier who had sat alone waiting without complaint, was someone whose name should have commanded a chair, a room a moment of honor the instant he'd walked through the door. Emily's breath caught painfully in her chest. She could feel the heat behind her eyes, the sharp sting of guilt she hadn't even realized was building until now. Across the room, Colonel Davis stood perfectly still, his profile sharp and unmoving. The silence stretched heavy and raw until Davis finally lifted his chin by a fraction, his gaze sweeping once across the room. He gave a small, sharp nod, not to anyone in particular, not as a request or invitation, but as a decision. Without a word, he turned on his heel and began walking towards the exit, his soaked boots marking a slow, deliberate path across the linoleum. Emily watched him go, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. No one in the room said a thing. No one dared. They simply watched as Davis moved every step, measured every movement unhurried, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what had just been revealed. Outside, the rain continued to fall in heavy, relentless sheets, drumming against the windows, pooling on the concrete outside the doors. And still waiting under the narrow, inadequate awning sat Bill Adams. His shoulders squared, his posture unchanged, the storm. No match for the quiet dignity that had carried him through a lifetime of service. Inside, the people who had once been so quick to dismiss him now stood in a hush, realizing fully painfully what they had failed to see. Davis reached the door, placed his hand on the handle, and without pause stepped out into the storm. No one needed to ask where he was going. They all knew. He was going to bring his commander in. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Colonel Robert Davis stepped out into the storm without hesitation. Rain hit him in a solid wave, soaking instantly through his uniform, flattening his hair, streaking down his face and collar. He didn't flinch. He didn't lift a hand to shield himself. Instead, he moved forward with measured, deliberate strides, his boots splashing through puddles as though they weren't even there. Inside the clinic, faces pressed up against the window, fogging the glass with nervous breath. Emily stood frozen near the desk, her fists clenched tight, heart hammering in her chest. Even Jim Carter had edged forward, his face pale, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. Nurses, veterans, staff, every eye was trained on the scene unfolding outside. Colonel Davis reached the bench where Lieutenant Colonel William Adams sat. Bill had not moved, not once, despite the rain hammering down on him, despite the cold that had soaked into his bones. His hands were folded, resting loosely on his lap, his back straight, his chin slightly lifted, his eyes steady as he watched Davis approach. Davis stopped precisely 2 feet in front of the bench. For a brief moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Two soldiers, two histories colliding in the middle of an ordinary storm. Without a word, Davis reached up and pulled off his cap, the rain immediately darkening his hair to black water running in thin rivulets down his temples. He held the cap at his side, his shoulders squaring. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand to his brow in a perfect salute, fingers razor-straight arm, locked with the precision of a man who had never forgotten the meaning behind the gesture. Inside, someone let out a shaky breath. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes shining as she watched. The room had fallen completely silent, the tension inside matching the weight of the moment unfolding outside. Bill Adams sat still for a long second, his eyes locked on Davis's face. His hands resting quietly twitched faintly as he began to move his joints stiff with cold, his fingers trembling just slightly from the chill that had seeped deep into his muscles. But he lifted his right hand slowly, steadily, until it mirrored Davis's, a salute. There were no medals pinned to their chests right now, no banners overhead, no speeches or cameras or polished tributes. There was only the rain, the storm, the simple, undeniable act of one soldier saluting another. And in that moment, no one watching, not inside the clinic, not behind the glass, could miss the truth. Some honors don't need to be spoken. Some respect doesn't need to be announced. The two men held the salute for a long, still beat, the rain pouring over them, soaking them both until it seemed the storm itself had paused to bear witness. Then, just as deliberately, Davis lowered his hand. He stepped forward, extending his arm, offering it without hesitation. Bill Adams gave him a small, wry smile, one corner of his mouth tugging upward, and grasped Davis's arm firmly as the younger man helped him rise from the soaked bench. Inside, Emily felt the burn of tears she hadn't expected. Around her, the room stayed silent, every pair of eyes still pressed to the window watching, as Davis turned, slightly shifting his body to shield Bill from the worst of the rain. From the side doors, the figure of Dr. Laura Harris emerged, a clipboard clutched awkwardly in one hand, her steps hurried and uneven as she rushed out, her expression tight with urgency and something that looked very much like guilt. Dr. Laura Harris hurried through the side doors, the wind nearly tearing the clipboard from her grasp as she struggled to hold an umbrella steady against the pounding rain. Her shoes splashed through rising puddles as she crossed the lot, heart-hammering eyes fixed on the two soaked figures ahead. The cold bit through her thin coat, but she barely noticed. "Colonel Davis," she called, her voice raised slightly above the storm. "Please wait." Davis turned slightly, his arm still firmly supporting Bill Adams, whose frame remained steady despite the long hours of cold and wet. His uniform clung to him, every line of fabric heavy with water, but his presence remained composed, solid. Dr. Harris slowed as she reached them. Her face flushed, the umbrella shaking slightly in her grip as the rain battered against it. "Colonel," she began quickly, "I want to personally apologize. We didn't know who he was. Please, don't misunderstand." Bill's voice, quiet but firm, cut through the space between them. "Doctor." Harris froze mid-sentence, her mouth half-open, eyes flicking sharply to the older man. Bill raised his gaze, deep-set eyes, unwavering calm, carrying a weight that no title or position could counter. His words were measured, soft, but they hit with the force of something much heavier. "The rain," he said, "evenly falls on everyone the same." He held her gaze for a beat longer. "The difference," he continued, "is who notices, who's getting wet." For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. "Doctor." Harris's throat worked as she tried to answer, her face coloring under the raw truth of his words. The clipboard trembled slightly in her grasp as her grip tightened involuntarily. She opened her mouth again, then stopped, her shoulders sagging almost imperceptibly as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Colonel Davis didn't wait. Without a glance back, he tightened his hold on Bill's arm, gently guiding him forward toward the waiting black SUV parked just beyond the entrance. Every step was measured, deliberate, their figures cutting a slow path through the driving rain. Inside, the clinic faces remained pressed to the glass eyes, wide expressions stunned as they watched the two men move away from the building without a word of acknowledgement, without a backward glance, without the need for any further confrontation. No one inside moved. No one dared. The storm outside raged on, but the real impact had already landed inside the walls they thought had shielded them, inside the systems they thought were enough. The conference room felt colder than usual, the overhead lights casting a harsh glare on the polished table where Dr. Laura Harris sat, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Around her, the department heads and senior staff shifted uneasily in their seats, their faces drawn, eyes flicking occasionally toward the floor or the walls, anywhere but at each other. Emily sat near the end, her back straight, her fingers nervously intertwined in her lap. Dr. Harris cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the heavy quiet. Effective immediately, she said, her voice firm, we will be implementing several changes to how this center operates. She lifted her gaze, sweeping it deliberately across the room. First, the entrance signage will be replaced. A new sign will be installed by the front doors, and above the parking lot, making it absolutely clear no veteran is ever to be left waiting outside under any circumstance. A ripple of murmurs stirred at the table. Harris raised a hand, cutting it off. Second, she continued, we are revising our intake protocols. From now on, every veteran who walks through those doors will be greeted and seated regardless of scheduling errors or system issues. No more turning people away because of capacity. We will create a contingency system, and if that means setting up extra chairs in the hallway or calling in additional staff, so be it. Jim Carter shifted in his chair, a flush creeping up his neck. With all due respect, Dr. Harris, he said, his voice tight, we followed procedure. The appointment wasn't valid. We can't be expected to predict. The slap of Harris's palm against the table cracked through the air, silencing him instantly. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes hard, her voice suddenly cold. We were wrong, Jim. Not just you. All of us. We were wrong the moment we saw that man as just a patient, instead of what he really was, a veteran, a commander, and a human being. The room went dead still. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. For the first time, she saw her boss not as a distant administrator, but as someone who had been forced to face her own failings head-on. Harris drew a slow breath, gathering herself. We will also begin mandatory training for all staff, new hires and veterans alike. Not just technical training, but human training. Every person in this room, every person working under this roof will know how to recognize the people we serve, how to respect them, and how to ensure they are never left unseen again. The tension in the room cracked just a little. Some shoulders slumped slightly. Some heads dipped. No one dared argue further. Harris sat back in her chair, her fingers pressing briefly to her temple. We failed, she said softly. And the only way we fix it is by making sure it never happens again. Outside the window, the late morning sun glinted off the wet pavement, drying slowly after the night's rain. Inside the room remained hushed, every person sitting with the weight of what had been laid bare. 3 weeks later, on a clear autumn morning, something unexpected would bring them face to face with that promise. The morning air was crisp, the kind that nipped at your fingers even under gloves, the sidewalks lined with scattered amber and red leaves, drifting gently across the ground. Inside the Veterans Medical Center, the lobby was quiet. The usual buzz of the day not yet begun. The overhead lights glowed softly, the faint scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Behind the front desk, Sarah Mills rubbed her hands together, blowing into them to fight the cold that still clung from her walk-in. Emily stood at the side, flipping through intake forms, her thoughts drifting as she glanced occasionally toward the window, watching the swirling leaves. Then, the door opened. Emily's head lifted as a figure stepped inside the light behind him, casting his silhouette across the floor. Bill Adams, dressed in a simple gray coat, his posture as straight and steady as ever, walked slowly but purposefully toward the front desk. His thin frame still carried the unmistakable air of command, a quiet dignity that filled the space without demanding it. In his arms he held a large cardboard box. He moved carefully, placing it gently onto the counter, before meeting Emily's wide eyes, with a faint, knowing smile. "Good morning, Miss Davis," Bill said softly. His voice was steady, smooth, carrying none of the bitterness or resentment he would have been entitled to feel. Emily opened her mouth, words caught in her throat. "Mr. Adams," she managed after a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect." He gave a small, gentle wave of his hand, cutting off her apology before it could begin. "I wanted to bring something," he said, simply patting the top of the box. "These are warm coats, all sizes, for any veteran who comes in without one. Thought maybe winter's coming." Sarah, who had been quietly watching from her station, felt her chest tighten as her eyes filled unexpectedly. She blinked rapidly, lowering her gaze as a flush crept up her cheeks. She remembered too well the day this man had sat outside in the freezing rain, the day she'd been too busy, too flustered, too caught up in rules to notice the human being right in front of her. Bill's eyes twinkled slightly, as if he sensed the room's silent tension, but had long since let it go. "I figured no one should be left cold," he added softly. Emily reached out her fingers, brushing the edge of the box. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick, sincere. "Thank you so much." Bill gave a small nod. "It's nothing," he murmured, turning slightly, as if ready to leave, as if this small act of kindness required no further acknowledgement. But the quiet weight of the moment hung heavy, unshakable. Here was a man who had been dismissed, overlooked, left in the rain because of a careless system, and yet here he was returning not with anger or complaint, but with a gift, an offering to make sure no one else endured what he had. It was the kind of quiet grace that didn't need a headline, the kind of dignity that reshaped the air around it without a word. Sarah cleared her throat softly, blinking hard, trying to steady herself. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to offer more than a shaky thank you, but the words caught. She lowered her head instead, pressing her hand briefly over her heart, as if trying to ground herself. Bill, ever perceptive, offered her a small, reassuring smile. No blame, no accusation. Only a soft nod, as if to say, "It's all right." The doors opened again, the chill air curling briefly inside as a young nurse stepped into the lobby. Rachel, fresh-faced and new to the staff, paused slightly when she saw the scene, the older man with the box, the two women at the desk looking unexpectedly emotional. She glanced between them, hesitant, unsure if she was interrupting something. "Excuse me," Rachel said softly, her voice edged with caution. "Are you Mr. Adams?" Bill turned a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "I am," he said, his voice kind, inviting. Rachel shifted on her feet, clasping her hands together nervously. Some of us on staff have been talking about the other day, about what happened." She drew a slow breath, cheeks coloring slightly. "I wanted to ask, why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Emily and Sarah both stilled, eyes turning sharply toward Bill. The question hung in the air. Delicate, vulnerable, the kind of question people carry but rarely dare to ask. Bill's eyes softened, his expression thoughtful. He glanced toward the window, watching a gust of wind scatter the fallen leaves. "I've learned something over the years," he said quietly, voice low but clear. "People's kindness, their decency, it means more when it's given to someone they think is no one." Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, confused but listening. Bill smiled faintly. "I wanted to see how this place would treat me when I was just an old man with no title, no medals, just a name on a card. Because how you treat someone without a label, that's the truth of who you are." The room fell into a quiet stillness. Emily felt her throat tighten again, a fresh surge of emotion washing through her. Sarah looked down, her hands trembling slightly on the counter's edge. Rachel, wide-eyed, nodded slowly, the lesson sinking in deeper than any training manual or orientation could ever offer. Bill gave them one last small smile, adjusting his coat lightly. "Take care," he said simply, turning to go. His steps were steady, unhurried, his back straight as he walked toward the doors, the autumn light spilling across the floor ahead of him. As the door opened, the wind caught the edge of his coat, sending it flapping softly around his legs. He didn't glance back, didn't wait for acknowledgement. His gift had been given, his words had been spoken, and that was enough. Inside, Emily exhaled shakily, placing a hand against the counter to steady herself. Sarah brushed a quick tear from the corner of her eye, turning slightly as if needing a moment to collect herself. The young nurse lingered, watching the door slowly close, the sound of it settling into the frame, lingering in the quiet that followed. None of them spoke for a long moment. There was no need. The lesson had been delivered, not with anger, not with demands, but with the quiet, indelible mark of a man who understood that true strength, true grace often walked in silently and left behind a better world without asking for applause. Bill Adams stood by the glass wall of the hallway, the morning sunlight gleaming off the polished surface and casting his reflection faintly beside him. Outside, the autumn breeze stirred the golden leaves, sending them dancing across the pavement in slow, graceful circles. His figure tall, despite age straight, despite years was almost motionless as he watched the play of wind and light, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Behind him, Rachel approached quietly, her white nurse's shoes, barely making a sound on the smooth floor. She hesitated a few steps away, uncertain whether to speak, fingers nervously clutching the clipboard she still carried, though her morning rounds were long finished. Finally gathering herself, she took a soft breath and moved closer. "Mr. Adams," she asked gently. He turned slightly his profile, reflecting calmly in the glass, a faint glimmer of a smile playing at the edge of his mouth. "Yes," dear Rachel's brow furrowed as she worked through her thoughts, her voice low and cautious. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about kindness and how people treat someone they think is no one." She paused, shifting slightly on her feet. "But sir, why didn't you just tell them who you were? Why didn't you explain you were a commander, a decorated officer?" Her eyes lifted, searching his face, confusion and genuine curiosity shining through. "You know they would have treated you differently. All you had to do was say it." For a moment, Bill was quiet. He glanced back out through the glass, watching as the wind pushed another small flurry of leaves across the sidewalk. His reflection shimmered softly on the surface, an old soldier standing beside himself, caught between past and present. Then, slowly, he turned fully toward Rachel, his eyes kind, thoughtful, the faint smile never quite leaving his face. "Do you know what the most dangerous trap is for a soldier, Rachel?" he asked gently, his voice low and even. Rachel shook her head slightly, her eyes wide, hanging on every word. "It's believing your rank is who you are," Bill continued softly. "Believing the medals, the titles, the stories others tell about you, that they define your worth." He let the words hang there for a moment, the quiet between them filled only by the faint rustling of the trees beyond the window. Rachel swallowed, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. Bill's smile deepened just slightly. "When you strip all that away," he said, "when no one knows your name or your history, when no one's looking to salute or take orders, that's when you find out the truth." He took a slow step closer, his presence still gentle, never imposing. "The truth of who they are, and the truth of who you are." Rachel's breath caught softly, her chest tightening with a rush of understanding she hadn't expected. "I could have told them," Bill went on, his eyes warm, his voice like a quiet thread weaving through the cold morning air. "And yes, they would have opened the doors, cleared the way, offered coffee, smiles, the best seat in the house. But I wasn't here to remind them who I am." His smile tilted faintly upward. "I was here to remind them who they are." The weight of the words settled gently but unmistakably between them. Rachel felt a sting prick behind her eyes, the kind of sudden, surprising emotion that came not from guilt, but from clarity. She pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly, willing herself not to cry. Bill reached out lightly, his hand brushing her shoulder with the briefest touch, a gesture of reassurance, of gratitude, of simple human connection. "You're young," he said softly. "You'll carry this lesson further than most." Rachel let out a shaky breath, a small, tremulous smile breaking through. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with feeling. Bill gave her a slow nod, his eyes glimmering with the quiet wisdom of someone who had carried more weight than most, seen more than most, and yet chosen always the path of grace. He stepped back slightly, his gaze lifting once more to the window, the world beyond it brightening under the clear autumn sky. And then his voice dropped just slightly, a murmur meant as much for himself as for anyone listening. "Every place remembers its heroes when they wear their medals," he said softly. "But the places worth saving, the people worth keeping. They remember them even when they don't." Rachel stood frozen, the words imprinting themselves on her like a slow, deep burn. Something she knew would stay with her far beyond this hallway, this building, this day. Outside, a gust of wind blew stronger, sending the leaves skittering faster, catching light in a flurry of gold and red. Bill watched it quietly, his silhouette steady, his presence calm. Inside, Rachel remained where she was, heart-full eyes glistening, carrying the quiet weight of the moment, knowing without question that this man who had stood in silence, who had given without needing recognition, had just given her something far more lasting than any medal or rank. And somewhere deep inside, she understood this was a story she would carry, a lesson she would pass on, a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The large central hall of the Veterans Medical Center was unusually quiet that afternoon. The usual hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, the muted beeping of machines all had faded, leaving behind only a heavy, expectant stillness. Bill Adams stood near the center of the space, his frame straight, despite the years, his eyes calm as they swept the gathered faces. Nurses, young veterans, administrative staff, and even senior supervisors lined the walls and corners, drawn together, not by an official order, but by the quiet gravity that now surrounded this man. Rachel stood just off to the side, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed intently on Bill. Emily hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly, face pale, heart thudding in her chest. Bill's voice, when it came, was not loud. "It didn't need to be. I didn't come here to test you." He began, his gaze steady, his tone smooth but edged with something unshakably firm. "I didn't come to see if you'd fail, or to prove a point, or to catch anyone off guard." He let the words hang there for a moment, allowing them to settle. "I came to see," he continued quietly, "how you would treat a man you thought was no one." A hush swept across the hall, a subtle tightening in the air. No one stirred. Not a commander. Bill went on, his eyes moving gently across the faces watching him. Not a decorated soldier, not a name in the system or a title on a file. Just a tired old man who'd kept his appointment card and showed up on time. His hands remained loosely folded in front of him, his voice soft but unwavering. "You see the measure of who we are? The real measure is never in how we treat the ones whose importance we already know. It's in how we treat the ones we don't." Sarah, standing near the reception desk, lowered her gaze, her cheeks coloring with shame. Jim, arms hanging stiffly at his sides, swallowed hard, the flush creeping up his neck, unmistakable. Bill's eyes softened slightly, but he didn't pull back the weight of his words. "Because it's easy to stand tall for the known hero," he said quietly. "It's easy to offer respect when you've been told someone has earned it. But true respect, real decency, is shown when you think you're looking at no one special." Near the back, one of the younger veterans shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Another near the window bowed his head slightly, the truth of the words cutting deeper than any reprimand could. Bill drew a slow breath, his voice softening just slightly. "And that lesson," he added, "isn't just for soldiers. It isn't just for hospitals or centers like this one. It's for everyone. For all of us." Out there in the world every day we pass by people whose stories we don't know. We cross paths with lives we never stop to see. And every one of those moments asks us the same question: who are you when no one's looking? Who are you when there's nothing to gain? The silence in the room deepened. Emily felt the back of her throat tighten, a sharp burn rising behind her eyes. Rachel blinked rapidly, her hands shaking slightly where they rested at her sides. Bill smiled faintly, a soft, almost wistful expression, and gave a small nod as if to himself. "Thank you for listening," he said quietly. "That's all I came to say." And then, with the simple dignity that had marked his every action since the day he arrived, he turned slowly, giving one final glance toward the gathered room. No one moved. No one spoke. Heads bowed slightly, shoulders stiffened, the weight of his words pressing gently but unmistakably onto every person present. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sunlight slanted softly across the pavement, catching on the last scattered leaves tumbling across the ground. Inside, the gathered staff and veterans remained frozen, not out of command or expectation, but out of the quiet, profound understanding that they had just received something far greater than a reprimand. They had been given a reminder, one they would carry forward, one they would pass on, one they would never quite shake. By the following week, the leadership at the center had made a decision. Bill's story and the lessons he had brought would not fade quietly. They would be recorded, preserved, and shared. In the administrative offices, a small team worked late into the evenings, compiling every detail, every conversation, every insight. The words Bill had spoken, the actions he had taken, and the reactions they had sparked would be woven into the center's official staff training, not as a cautionary tale, but as a living reminder. It wasn't about medals or titles. It was about seeing the unseen, respecting the unheard. It was about making sure no one, no matter how ordinary they appeared, was ever left sitting in the rain again. The large central hall of the Veterans Medical Center was unusually quiet that afternoon. The usual hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, the muted beeping of machines all had faded, leaving behind only a heavy, expectant stillness. Bill Adams stood near the center of the space, his frame straight, despite the years, his eyes calm as they swept the gathered faces. Nurses, young veterans, administrative staff, and even senior supervisors lined the walls and corners, drawn together, not by an official order, but by the quiet gravity that now surrounded this man. Rachel stood just off to the side, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed intently on Bill. Emily hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly, face-pale, heart thudding in her chest. Bill's voice, when it came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. "I didn't come here to test you," he began, his gaze steady, his tone smooth but edged with something unshakably firm. "I didn't come to see if you'd fail, or to prove a point, or to catch anyone off guard." He let the words hang there for a moment, allowing them to settle. "I came to see," he continued quietly, "how you would treat a man you thought was no one." A hush swept across the hall, a subtle tightening in the air. No one stirred. Not a commander. Bill went on, his eyes moving gently across the faces watching him. Not a decorated soldier. Not a name in the system or a title on a file. Just a tired old man who'd kept his appointment card and showed up on time. His hands remained loosely folded in front of him, his voice soft but unwavering. "You see, the measure of who we are, the real measure, is never in how we treat the ones whose importance we already know. It's in how we treat the ones we don't." Sarah, standing near the reception desk, lowered her gaze, her cheeks coloring with shame. Jim, arms hanging stiffly at his sides, swallowed hard, the flush creeping up his neck unmistakable. Bill's eyes softened slightly, but he didn't pull back the weight of his words. "Because it's easy to stand tall for the known hero," he said quietly. "It's easy to offer respect when you've been told someone has earned it. But true respect, real decency, is shown when you think you're looking at no one special." Near the back, one of the younger veterans shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Another near the window bowed his head slightly, the truth of the words cutting deeper than any reprimand could. Bill drew a slow breath, his voice softening just slightly. And that lesson, he added, isn't just for soldiers. It isn't just for hospitals or centers like this one. It's for everyone, for all of us. Out there in the world, every day we pass by people whose stories we don't know. We cross paths with lives we never stop to see. And every one of those moments asks us the same question: who are you when no one's looking? Who are you when there's nothing to gain? The silence in the room deepened. Emily felt the back of her throat tighten, a sharp burn rising behind her eyes. Rachel blinked rapidly, her hands shaking slightly where they rested at her sides. Bill smiled faintly, a soft, almost wistful expression, and gave a small nod as if to himself. "Thank you for listening," he said quietly. "That's all I came to say." And then, with the simple dignity that had marked his every action since the day he arrived, he turned slowly, giving one final glance toward the gathered room. No one moved. No one spoke. Heads bowed slightly, shoulders stiffened, the weight of his words pressing gently but unmistakably onto every person present. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sunlight slanted softly across the pavement, catching on the last scattered leaves tumbling across the ground. Inside, the gathered staff and veterans remained frozen, not out of command or expectation, but out of the quiet, profound understanding that they had just received something far greater than a reprimand. They had been given a reminder, one they would carry forward, one they would pass on, one they would never quite shake. By the following week, the leadership at the center had made a decision. Bill's story and the lessons he had brought would not fade quietly. They would be recorded, preserved, and shared. In the administrative offices, a small team worked late into the evenings, compiling every detail, every conversation, every insight. The words Bill had spoken, the actions he had taken, and the reactions they had sparked would be woven into the center's official staff training, not as a cautionary tale, but as a living reminder. It wasn't about medals or titles. It was about seeing the unseen, respecting the unheard. It was about making sure no one, no matter how ordinary they appeared, was ever left sitting in the rain again. The meeting room was filled with the low hum of anticipation. A group of new employees, young nurses, administrative staff, junior technicians sat lined in neat rows, their eyes flicking occasionally between each other and the wide projection screen at the front. The air carried that unmistakable mixture of fresh eagerness and quiet uncertainty, the kind that always filled a room on the first day of official training. At the front, Emily Davis stood confidently, her hands resting lightly on the table, a small clicker in her palm. She smiled gently as she surveyed the faces before her, but her heart carried a subtle weight, one she had learned to wear gracefully since the day that had changed this center forever. Beside her stood Dr. Laura Harris, the director, her posture upright, her eyes calm but thoughtful. Together they prepared to introduce something no manual or policy document could fully explain. Emily clicked the remote. The large screen came alive with the title slide, "The Commander Who Waited in the Rain Lessons in Service and Dignity." The room quieted further. Emily began softly, her voice steady. "Before we go over our procedures, I want to share with you a story. Not because it's part of the rules, but because it's part of who we are." She paused briefly, allowing her eyes to meet a few in the front row. "It's a story about a man named Bill Adams, a man many here almost overlooked." The slide changed, showing an old photograph of Bill not in uniform, but sitting quietly on a bench, rain soaking his jacket, his posture calm, dignified. Emily continued, her tone measured. One day, due to a simple scheduling error, Bill was told to wait outside in the rain. No one recognized his name. No one saw the rank behind the civilian coat. No one knew the history he carried. On the screen text appeared Lieutenant Colonel William Adams, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross, Commander of Extraction Operations. The new staff shifted slightly, their faces tightening as the realization began to set in. Emily clicked again, and yet she continued. Bill chose to wait quietly. He didn't announce himself. He didn't demand attention. He chose instead to observe to see how we treated someone we thought was just another patient. A quiet murmur rippled at the back of the room, subtle but unmistakable. Emily smiled faintly. What happened next became a turning point for us. It wasn't the medals that changed how we saw Bill. It was the moment we realized we had failed to see him as a human being in the first place. Beside her, Dr. Harris let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting momentarily toward the window. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the last of the leaves along the pavement, the light glinting off the new brass plaque installed by the entrance. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, almost a whisper. "One quiet man," she said, "but he taught an entire generation." The slide faded to black, and the room sat in stillness, a weighty pause lingering in the air. 3 weeks earlier, the administrative team had finalized the decision Bill's story would become part of every new hire orientation, not as a formality, but as a living reminder. His name, his actions, his words. The rain falls on everyone the same. The difference is who notices who's getting wet had become a kind of compass, a guiding star for how they chose to move forward as an institution. The presentation wrapped up, the lights lifted, and the new staff filed quietly out of the room, their conversations hushed, reflective. Emily remained standing by the table, her fingers lightly tapping the edge, her gaze thoughtful. As the room emptied, Dr. Harris gave a small nod. "It worked," she murmured softly. He left more than a story behind. Outside on the front lawn of the center, the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the grass. At the edge of the property, a large new sign gleamed softly in the light. "Veterans are always welcome, rain or shine." Further down the walkway, Bill Adams moved slowly away from the building. His steps unhurried, his figure tall despite the years. His coat fluttered lightly in the breeze, his silhouette small but unmistakable against the vast stretch of open sky. From the entrance, Colonel Robert Davis stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back, watching Bill's figure retreat. He didn't call out. He didn't follow. He simply stood there, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth, a silent salute in his eyes. No one else spoke. No more words were needed. Some stories don't end with applause or fanfare. Some stories end with the quiet satisfaction of knowing something was left better than it was before. And this story of one man's quiet patience, his silent strength, his unshakable dignity was now woven into the walls, the hearts, the daily rhythms of a place that had once failed to see him. For the viewers, the message was clear, and it reached out past the boundaries of the screen, past the walls of the building, past the limits of military or civilian life. It was a lesson that belonged to everyone. The way you treat the nameless, the way you regard the unrecognized, the way you respect those who carry no labels, that is the truest reflection of who you are. If you believe that silence can sometimes teach more than words, if you believe that dignity lies not in titles but in actions, if you believe that no one should be forgotten simply because they do not demand to be remembered, then share this story. Not for Bill Adams, but for every quiet figure sitting on a bench, waiting unseen under the falling rain. The screen faded to black, no credits, no teaser for the next episode, no dramatic promises of a follow-up. Only the quiet echo of the final image, a man walking away, no longer waiting, no longer needing recognition, and a community left behind changed, watching, remembering, and perhaps, just perhaps, becoming better. Some stories don't need a sequel. Some stories close with the kind of quiet finality that lingers not in headlines or applause, but deep inside the hearts of those who hear them. The story of Bill Adams is one of those rare tales not about grand speeches or public medals, but about the silent power of dignity patience, and how one man's quiet presence reshaped an entire community's sense of honor. As you sit with this story, ask yourself, How do you treat the people you think no one's watching? How do you honor the ones who don't announce themselves, who ask for nothing but deserve everything? If this story touched you, if you believe that small acts can carry the biggest lessons, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that reveal the quiet truths behind everyday lives. Let's make sure no one, not the loud, not the quiet, not the seen or the unseen, is ever left standing alone in the rain again.